Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Palestinian rockets continuing to rain down in the hundreds indiscriminately on Israeli civilian regions. Israel responding with hundreds of airstrikes of its own. So stay tuned for this and more. It's been a long night and now day in Israel, with roughly 400 rockets and counting fired towards Israeli civilian communities amidst widespread violent clashes spreading out from Jerusalem. Over 137 rockets being fired within just 5 minutes earlier this afternoon, with one hitting a school in Ashkelon and another landing on a residential building in Ashdod. At least 2 Israeli civilians so far have died from resulting injuries, with several others left in critical condition. Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system working overtime Monday night and Tuesday morning. Over 250 rockets and counting fired towards Israeli areas both near the Gaza Strip and as far as Jerusalem in just under 24 hours. And the projectiles primarily hitting the southern Israeli residential communities of Ashkelon, Sderot, and their neighboring towns. In Ashkelon, just 6 kilometers from the Hamas terror group-run Gaza, at least 31 Israelis have been injured. 6 hospitalized civilians coming from just one building hit overnight, 4 of whom are from the same family. Residents blasting Israeli authorities for having too few accessible bomb shelters nearby. And not just in the south, however. The IDF releasing a map of its red light warning system, with orange districts spreading from Gaza out to the Negev in the south and Gedera to the north, and yellow districts as far as the Gush Dan region, which includes Tel Aviv and Holon. Israel, for its part, responding harshly to the violence. Prime Minister Netanyahu promising retaliation at the main Jerusalem Day ceremony last night.
ארגוני הטרור בעזה חצו לפנות ערב ביום ירושלים קו אדום ותקפו אותנו בטילים במבואות ירושלים. לא נסבול פגיעה בשטחנו, בבירתנו, באזרחינו ובחיילינו. מי שתוקף אותנו ישלם מחיר כבד.
Netanyahu and other state authorities clarifying, though, their hopes not to escalate into full-scale war. Ground forces not yet given the go-ahead. Rather, border guard forces have been increased with reserves, and Israeli air forces have carried out targeted attacks against Hamas infrastructure, including military installations, tunnels, a top commander's home, and terror cells preparing attacks. All in all, the IDF responding with at least 130 strikes overnight, Palestinian sources reporting 23 dead. The IDF saying most were Hamas members or victims of errant Gaza rockets, not IDF strikes. Hamas also regularly stations military equipment in civilian buildings, intentionally putting innocents in the line of fire. Meanwhile, further from Gaza, Israeli police dealing with riots continuing to spread as the rocket fire continues. East Jerusalemites, for one, cheering for Hamas and their ongoing barrages as red alert sirens blare.
هذا نصر إلنا. حماس أوفت ووعدت. هذا وعد. وعدونا بدهم يضربوا الساعة 6 وأوفوا بالوعد.
Joining me now with additional details on the security front, fellow with the Jewish People Policy Institute, IDF Reserves, Major Dan Pfefferman. Major, thank you so much for being with us. Is the violence, both with Gaza and on the ground across the country, showing any signs of slowing? What can we expect in the coming hours and days?
Right, and although I have a background of Jerusalem, it's only virtual. I'm actually closer to Gaza than I am to Jerusalem, and so if there's a siren here, I might have to stop in the middle. Looking at past such instances of escalation with Hamas and Gaza, we can expect this to go on for another day, possibly even a few days. The question here is Hamas, for internal reasons, just like we heard the gentleman at the end of the news clip saying, look at how Hamas is succeeding. They are trying to take over as the legitimate leaders of the Palestinian resistance to show that the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah are ineffectual, and they are the ones who are willing to put themselves on the line and stand up to Israel. They are playing a symbolic game. It's a strategic move by them, and they're hoping that at a time when we're trying to put together a coalition government, at a time when we have a shaky political situation here, we're not going to be looking for any kind of escalation, and so that they can continue firing the rockets, and that it's Israel is going to be the one to give in first. It's imperative that Israel establish its escalation dominance in this situation to show Hamas that the price that it will extract from it is going to be much greater than any kind of symbolic or strategic victory that Hamas gets. And in such a scenario, we can imagine a few days, perhaps at most, of such fire from Hamas, and of course, retaliatory strikes from Israeli Defense Forces.
All right. Thank you so much for your insights, Major in the Reserves Dan Pfefferman with JPPI. Thank you again. Meanwhile, as Israel and Gaza trade blows, international equivocations and condemnations against Israel are seemingly growing. Some in the Arab world, like in Jordan, even calling for the elimination of peace agreements with Israel. But here with more on Zoom, political and peace activist Moshe Chertoff, and in studio, CEO of Honest Reporting, Daniel Pomerantz. Daniel, I'll start with you. What do you make of the latest escalations, and additionally, the international community's response to them?
The international community has responded at best with concern and worry about Israel's actions, and at worst with outright condemnation. The White House has expressed concern. The UN Security Council is trying to push through a resolution condemning Israel. Generally, the narrative around the world, and it's a word that I hate, but it's come to characterize news. It's not about what happened, it's about the story you want to tell. The narrative that has characterized most of the world is that Israel began this by attacking Muslims at Ramadan prayers, and Hamas responded to those attacks by firing rockets, and then Israel in turn responded by killing children.
All right. Well, Moshe, how would you characterize the framing of this conflict, and especially the context and the supposed Palestinian motivations?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having me here, and hello to Daniel also. I want to start off by thanking and complimenting our soldiers in the IDF and their defense capabilities in protecting all of our residents in Israel. It's very important, and my heart is with all of those who are running to shelters. And yes, also with the peaceful civilians of Gaza. They're suffering no less.
Absolutely.
So far, with 2 killed today, and that's too many in Israel, and with over 25 dead actually by now in Gaza and hundreds of injured there, it doesn't matter what the numbers will be. And I hope the numbers remain where they are and don't increase. But this is not a matter of, it's not a contest. It's
Absolutely.
It's not like we're going to be convinced and just leave Palestine, or they're just going to be convinced and leave Israel. That's not going to happen. So the situation as I see it, it is or was predictable, it was preventable, it is pointless, and it's actually a hopeless war because I can't see anything really good coming out of it. If we may demand that Hamas do some actual reasonable assessment of their possible achievements, should they be doing soul searching to try to possibly come to the conclusion of, well, maybe we shouldn't be firing missiles into civilian populations, then shouldn't we also be doing soul searching about our responses and possibly holding back a bit and trying to open up another channel for solving the conflict, the current state of the conflict. And as a matter of fact, just yesterday, I participated in a march called the March of Flowers with an organization that I belong to called the Tag Meir Forum. We marched through the old city and into the village of Silwan and handed out flowers to Jews and Arabs, to everyone who was passing, trying to promote free love, not in the hippie sense, but free love as opposed to free hate or sinat chinam. And I think that we got our point across. Of course, we didn't convince everyone, neither Jews nor Arabs. And there's going to be more conflict.
Again, though, Moshe, as I mentioned, we're hearing condemnations from the Gaza rocket, or for the Gaza rockets and the incendiary devices that have targeted civilian communities. We are hearing condemnations internationally, but it's also coming with equivocations from the international community, including from both the UN and from Washington, as we mentioned, in which officials are calling on all sides to de-escalate. Is this a fair response? Because it sounds like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad are being given a sort of moral equivalence to the IDF.
Well, like I said, it's not a contest, and therefore all sides should be encouraged to hold back as best they can. If we look back, I don't think any of our previous incursions, including land incursions into Gaza, either stopped this, obviously, because we're having more missiles. They're not delaying it. In fact, we just saw the largest barrage of missiles ever. So apparently that strategy isn't working. So I think that we should actually take the advice of the international community. I don't think we even need them to advise us. We should understand that by now, after 54 years of this situation, it's in our hands. We can actually make the difference. And yes, if necessary, the previous governments have negotiated with Hamas, and that's what we should be doing now. It's not a matter of pride. Pride won't bring those two people back. Pride won't bring back the boys who are still in Gaza as of the last war that we had. We have to think about all of these people. I think that provocations, threats, violence, and retaliations will only lead to more of the same. They're not going to actually stop anything, either missile attacks or whatever. So I believe that peace is possible, and it's the only way, and we should be moving in that direction as quickly as possible.
All right. Well, Daniel, I want to get your response, especially in the back of now President Rivlin actually responding to the international community, specifically to the EU, saying no country in the world would accept a similar situation. We'll never accept this reality and will defend our citizens. And he also mentions that, quote unquote, Palestinian extremists have turned the Temple Mount into a cache of weapons and a base for attacks. So with all that in mind, again, how would you respond?
Yeah, and it's important to remember that President Rivlin is a left-leaning politician and by no means a hawk. Look, I agree with Moshe in the sense that, that we should be as restrained as we possibly can, but let's remember, after hundreds of attacks, incendiary devices, explosive devices, and rocks against police on the Temple Mount, the total number of deaths of Palestinians in Jerusalem has come to a grand total of 0. That is an astonishing level of restraint. And to say that Israel has been anything less than inhumanly restrained, I think is unfair to the young men and women in uniform who are risking their lives with enormous restraint. The response in Gaza has also been tremendously restrained. The number of casualties, given the number of sorties Israel has had, is extremely low, and many of them are the result, it's still being confirmed, it appears many are the result of own goals, of Hamas rockets that landed back in Gaza. So, of course, we want to find a way to peace, but to say that we aren't making an effort to do that, I think it is terribly unfair. And if we have the time, do we have a moment? I'd like to point out something that everyone's missing about how this started. That the families that were potentially going to be evicted from their homes, they said do we have time for this? They said in an interview on May 4th that they actually understand that Jews were living in those homes before they were. They were there for generations. Jews were there for more generations. They feel that pain. Jews feel that pain. They wanted to reach a compromise. The Palestinian Authority threatened them with physical violence if they would dare to reach a compromise and turn them into political pawns. We have Palestinian governments and terror groups trying to prevent peace among people who already want it.
All right, well, more on that in a moment, because we've heard a lot about the factors that have contributed to this latest round of violence. Among them, some point to the controversial evictions planned for Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, while others have pointed to alleged Israeli and Jewish encroachments on the Temple Mount, atop which the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound was built. Jordanian Waqf official Sheikh Abdul Azim Salhab, for one, accusing Israel of wanting to Judaize Israel, Judaize Jerusalem especially. But few outside of Israel are pointing to ongoing Palestinian incitements, compounded by the annual Iran-initiated Quds Day. The following are Quds Day remarks made by Hamas Politburo member and former Minister of Interior Fatih Hamad, as translated by MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute.
عطوا رقاب اليهود كلها هي تقف على العرق من هان 5 شيكل تشتري لك سكينه واضيه مضيها وهنا على طول حزه 5 شيكل 5 شيكل انك تذل دولة الكافر لا تجدن أشد الناس عداوة للذين آمنوا اليهود والذين أشركوا لقد أفسد اليهود لقد تغطرس اليهود وآن الآن حسابهم.
So how much of this recent uptick in violence truly stems from issues in Jerusalem as opposed to external sources, that is to say Iran and its proxies like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, etc., simply using Jerusalem and the Palestinians as a pretext to incite attacks on Israel? Returning now to discuss, I'm here again with CEO of Honest Reporting Daniel Pomerantz and via Zoom political and peace activist Moshe Chertoff. Moshe, again, we'll start with you, your perspective on what we just heard and my questions that I posed.
I don't think anybody in their right mind would be in favor of incitement to violence. At least they shouldn't be. And that is true on both sides. And it's not just a matter of Palestinian extremists that are fueling the fire here. I don't think, or it's obvious to me, that the whole situation did not start in Sheikh Jarrah. We have to go back and understand that people in Sheikh Jarrah and other villages, not neighborhoods of Jerusalem, villages like Silwan and others, have been living in a situation for 54 years where they were annexed into the Jerusalem municipality, but not given Israeli citizenship. So when it comes to them having a voice as to who should influence, for instance, the current situation in our government, they don't have a voice. They can't vote for who they think would be the right people to actually stop the violence on all sides. So first of all, let me go back and just mention, relating to what Daniel said previously, President Rivlin is not left. And it's ridiculous to even insinuate that he's anywhere near left. He has so far been a very neutral president, trying not to lean in any direction, but yes, making decisions in both directions. He's not a leftist, so I have no suspicion of his desires or his intents. There has been incitement, and in fact, I heard it yesterday when I walked through the streets of the old city. I've heard it from Jews for the most part. I did hear it only once from any Palestinians, and that was only because they hadn't stopped and understood why we were handing out flowers, and they were angry, and I understand their anger, and I also understand that although many homes in Sheikh Jarrah and also in Silwan in particular belonged in the past to Jewish families, that doesn't mean that I have the right now to just go in and take it back or go through the court process to take it back. We have to understand that these are people, for the most part, in Sheikh Jarrah, who were expelled or left Israel back in 1948, and now they're being expelled again. I don't think any of us would be going along with that. And as to the Gaza response, I'm very proud of Mordechai Analevich and the people who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto when we were being held back. And I'm not making any equivalence here, but I don't believe that anyone who is being treated unfairly, undemocratically, inhumanely should be limited to just being nice for 54 years. I'm not saying they should react violently in any way, but I don't know what we can expect of them.
Daniel?
And I think that if we get into negotiations, we should eventually end the naval blockade of Gaza and open up to the people of Gaza, having some hope for the future, and that might release some of the tension that's there.
So Moshe, I'm going to turn now to Daniel. Your response?
Well, let's correct some facts here. Everybody in Jerusalem has been offered citizenship. Some Palestinians in Jerusalem chose to refuse citizenship as a sign of protest against Israel's existence, or at least Israel's existence in Jerusalem. If they don't have a voice after having been offered and refused citizenship, that's a choice they made, and it's still a choice that they can unmake and claim citizenship now when they want it. But they've chosen not to. Now, look, people are suffering. There's no question about that. Palestinians are suffering. They're being brutalized by Hamas, by the Palestinian Authority, and that has to stop. And the world has to stand up and say, Hamas is on the terror lists of almost every country in the Western world.
Is Israel exacerbating that, though?
Is Israel making the situation worse for Palestinians living under Hamas and the Palestinian Authority? I'm trying to imagine how. Life under those organizations is pretty bad as it is. It's painful, it's angering. Can Israel do something to alleviate it? I would certainly hope so. But to say that Israel has the ability to make life better for people who live under their own government, it just is not logical or sensible.
All right. Moshe Chertoff, thank you again for being with us, and Daniel Pomerantz, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Peace to everyone.
Now, in other news, Israelis fighting literal war on one front and a lawfare war against BDS in another. The Psagot winery in Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, claiming victory in the Canadian Court of Appeals. With the details, we're joined by civil rights attorney and founder and executive director of the Lawfare Project, Brooke Goldstein. Brooke, thanks so much for being with us. Tell us a little bit about this case.
Well, first I want to say, to put it all in context, like you did in the intro, we are here in Israel and rockets are literally raining down on us, targeting Jewish people who want to live in peace and security in their homeland. And at the same time, there are people trying to set legal precedents in foreign courts that legitimize these attacks by saying that the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria is itself illegal and therefore should be labeled differently. And that was what was at issue in the Psagot winery case. Now, fortunately, we had a victory. The Federal Court of Appeals ruled that it is perfectly lawful to label Jewish products produced in Judea as made in Israel, and overturned the lower court's decision. And what's so significant is that, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask, what went into proving Psagot's case, but it sounds like you were about to get to that.
Right. So what's so significant is that, well, I'll start with this. RELAW, together with the Lawfare Project, represented Psagot Winery, and we were allowed as an affected party, to make oral arguments and submissions. And what the Court of Appeal ended up ruling was that, number one, the lower court's decision that you could not label it Psagot products made in Israel was illogical on its face. The decision was sent back to the administrative body. The appeals court said that the lower court had no authority whatsoever to make these types of decisions, and sent it back saying that the court's decision was not binding. So now, even though we've won this battle, we have not won the war, lawfare, as you said in the beginning, because this is really going to, unfortunately, open the floodgates now for people who, again, support this racist premise that Jews have no right to live in Judea and Samaria to now make further legal submissions before the administrative body, trying to convince it to reverse its original decision, which is to correctly label Psagot bottles as made in Israel.
So speaking of future potential lawsuits, which you are telling me is basically a certainty, what precedent will this have or will have in the international arena as well?
So I want to be quite clear that this is an administrative body. The lawsuit happened, we made oral arguments, and it was in the form of an appeal of a federal court's decision. So now the administrative body, which is the one that's in charge of making decisions about labeling, has the authority to continue to do so. Hopefully, and I trust they will continue to make the right decision to label these wines as made in Israel, which also brings Canadian policy well in line with U.S. policy. You may recall that Psagot Winery was also the plaintiff in a lawsuit that it filed and lost at the European Court of Justice. But even though in Europe, discriminatory labeling has been legitimized, what did that do? It created a situation that the United States, through Secretary of State Pompeo, came to Israel, landed and had an event at Psagot Winery declaring U.S. policy also to be consistent with Canada's, that we will label these products made in Israel. If a Jew cannot live in Judea and Samaria and work in peace and pray in peace and live with their family, our civil rights are violated everywhere, which is why this decision is so significant. And I'm glad it was the correct one.
All right, Brooke Goldstein, thank you so much for being with us. And that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.27 shekels to the American dollar and 2.7 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Please stay safe, and thank you so much for watching.